Putin is furious. The Russian army has completely failed its loudly announced summer offensive. In occupied Donetsk, unrest against the authorities is growing due to the lack of water. Washington has stated that Putin is finally ready to end the war. A peace agreement is already on his desk. Trump threatened Ukraine with sanctions, and Poland is threatening to block Ukraine's accession to the EU because of the Volhynia tragedy. The head of Chechnya, Kadyrov, is ill and is preparing the country for his passing. India's leader Modi is offended by the tariffs imposed by the US and doesn't answer the phone when the White House calls. A powerful drone attack on Russia. Kremlin-affiliated public pages are reporting that Yanukovych has died in Rostov. Hello, my name is Anastasia Dmitrovskaya. Right now, let's talk about the main news. But first, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so we don't lose touch with you on YouTube. Russia's summer offensive in Ukraine has failed. This is stated by Bild's military observer Julian Rapka. He writes that despite Russia's fastest offensive pace since last November, over the 3 summer months, the occupiers managed to capture only 0.3% of Ukrainian territory, which is roughly equivalent to 1,800 square kilometers. Most of the objectives that Moscow set for the offensive from April to August 2025 remain unachieved. Pokrovsk has not been captured. The so-called buffer zones in the Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv regions have not been established. The front line in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions has remained frozen. Ukrainian military personnel also say that Russia's offensive has failed. The Russians completely failed in the Donbas this summer thanks to the efforts of the defense forces. We disrupted all their offensive plans. At the same time, it must be acknowledged that the Russians continue to make slow advances on the front. In particular, deep state analysts report that in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the enemy has occupied Zaporizhzhia and Novohrihorivka. The enemy is exerting pressure on Zaporizhzhia and Novohrihorivka from the direction of Zeleny Pol and the village of Timirivka, which, when the advance was first recorded, some considered as a potential movement toward Huliapol, which, as it turned out, was clearly not the case. After all, the enemy now has the opportunity to advance in that area with an effective bypass of Komishuvaka and Malivka, which they have been unable to capture. However, later there was a report that the Ukrainians managed to drive the enemy out of these settlements. In addition, our military reports that the Russians are also advancing in the Zaporizhzhia direction. The enemy has advanced in the Zaporizhzhia direction, particularly in the settlement of Stepnohirsk, where they have taken positions in the southern and southwestern parts of the settlement. The status of the enemy is currently unknown. It's unclear whether these are just random guys who slipped through and are hiding in basements, or if they're forces that have properly entrenched themselves and whose positions now mark the front line of their defense. Our military also reports that so-called kill zones, or areas saturated with a large number of enemy FPV drones, are now gradually appearing along the entire line of contact. And again, this problem is already present in the Kherson, Pokrovsk and Kupiansk directions. But by the beginning of 2026, the concept of kill zones will become the main approach on the battlefield. The nature of combat operations will undergo significant changes. The role of drone units will increase even further, and everything will depend on their competent and organized actions, on their ability to independently carry out coordinated tactical operations, rather than acting on the principle of, if you see something, run, if not, wait. So infantry units, get ready. And drone operators, keep training because the entire situation on the battlefield will depend on this. But despite the Russians' advantage in manpower and equipment, it is thanks to them that Ukrainian soldiers are holding the front. The much-anticipated summer offensive has failed spectacularly. I know they're watching us, so as always, I urge you to write words of support for them in the comments. Remember we told you about the difficult water situation in Donbas?
4 Kalmak Street, Kirovsky District, Donetsk. The barrel was supposed to be filled according to the schedule, but there's still no water. People have nowhere to get water from. It is completely empty. Where exactly is all of the water? Where is the water now?
So it seems that the situation hasn't just failed to improve, but has actually gotten worse. The Russian authorities are completely cutting off all the major cities of Donbas one by one. Starting today, the water supply will be temporarily reduced in Yenakiyevo, Debaltsevo, Yuno-Komunarovsk, the city of Kirovsk, Zhdanovsk and Shakhtersk. The reason for this mass shutdown was allegedly an accident. Later, local authorities reported that the water supply in Yenakiyevo, Debaltsevo and Yuno-Komunarovsk would be restored during the day. But this hasn't really improved the overall water situation. Residents of Donetsk who have been without water for a month already have appealed to the head of the so-called DPR, Denis Pushilin.
Denis Vladimirovich and Andrei Alexandrovich, we are reaching out to you in the hope that it will be possible to rectify the violation of citizens' constitutional rights to access water and to lawfully ensure equal conditions for subscribers' access to water supply and wastewater services in accordance with Federal Law No. 4416 of December 7, 2011, as amended on January 1st, 2025.
And what, in my opinion, is very telling and says a lot about the so-called Russian world. People say that in the neighboring shopping and entertainment center there is water, and they even plan to open an ice rink there.
The inaction of the employees of Voda Donbassa and Gorvodokanal, and possibly even corruption, leads to the situation where right next to our homes is the Donetsk city shopping mall, which is supplied with water and operates without interruption, including the facilities inside, a car wash, the Biorhythm Sports Club with shower cabins, the supermarket's own production, 5 food outlets, and there are even plans to reopen the ice rink in the fall. And at the same time, in 10 buildings around, there is simply no water even on supply days, even at the connection points. That is, even once every 3 days, water doesn't come during the scheduled time. This clearly shows a failure to follow the water supply schedule that was announced a month ago on July 22, 2025.
Well, to be honest with you, I have no words. As they say, it's just pure emotion. Russia is deliberately trying to leave Ukraine without gas this winter. In fact, Ukraine's Ministry of Energy has reported that the enemy is attacking energy and gas transportation infrastructure in the Sumy, Poltava, Donetsk, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhzhia regions. We regard the Russian attacks as a continuation of Russia's deliberate policy to destroy Ukraine's civilian infrastructure on the eve of the heating season. This is yet another act of energy terrorism directed against the civilian population. Meanwhile, in Russian public forums, Russia's strikes on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure are not only confirmed, but even boasted about. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, gas storage facilities are on fire after a strike by the Russian armed forces. Ukraine is becoming a suitcase without a handle. Russia is a terrorist state. Give this video a like if you agree with this axiom. And also, I know that many of you are watching us from outside Ukraine. Write in the comments which country you're watching us from and whether your people support Ukrainians in their fight against the empire of evil. I really love reading your comments. They somehow make things feel a bit lighter. As they say, you can watch 3 things forever: fire, water, and the work of Ukrainian drones in Russia. In the Ryazan region, the Ryazan-Moscow main oil pipeline came under attack. Even Russians themselves are writing that an explosion was heard near the pipeline, after which a fire broke out. In fact, this oil pipeline is one of the main sources supplying petroleum products to Moscow. Since 2018, the main pipeline has been repurposed to supply automotive gasoline for the state company Transneft, which in turn supplies the occupier's army. And naturally, all of this already has consequences. An oil superpower without gasoline. Russia is experiencing a real gasoline crisis. And the reason is that, just think about it, in recent times, Ukrainian armed forces drones have destroyed 17% of Russia's oil refineries. Now, in many regions of Russia, there is a real fuel collapse. Crazy lines at gas stations, and in temporarily occupied Crimea, gasoline is now being sold only with ration cards. Our journalists know all the details.
Gasoline shortage in the country, gas stations, Russia. The official explanation for the shortage is unscheduled maintenance at oil refineries. Russian propaganda is hiding the real reason.
The line on Melniknaya, right there on the road. Oh, it's quite a significant line.
The fuel shortage has been felt most acutely in Zabaikalsky Krai, Primorsky Krai, and the temporarily occupied Crimea.
As I see it, there are 2 reasons for this fuel shortage. The first is what everyone is talking about. This is the undeniable fact that significant strikes were indeed carried out on some crucial Russian oil refineries, and this particular situation, let's say, consequently created a profound physical shortage of essential fuel, which is now leading to its increasing scarcity.
Since the beginning of August, Ukrainian drones have attacked Russian oil refining infrastructure. In less than 3 weeks, at least 7 of the largest refineries were affected, and they had to completely halt production. The first to be hit were the Ryazan and Novokuybishevsk oil refineries. Look, it's about to blow up. Did you get it on camera? Oh, unbelievable. 5 days later, the Afipsky refinery came under attack.
Look, a drone has arrived at the plant.
On August 14th, one of the largest industry plants in the Russian Federation, Volgograd, stopped working. The next day, UAVs hit the Syzran oil refinery.
Drones are flying. Drones?
There is no internet. The factory is on fire. And on Samara News, we're watching something quite significant unfold. The very last incident, occurring late at night on the 21st of August, saw the Novoshakhtinsk refinery being directly hit. This event is certainly noteworthy and has drawn considerable attention.
I think there's another reason that no one is talking about publicly. But based on the experience of a similar situation in Russia, which happened in September 2023, it's quite possible that this is the case. It's the cancellation of the damper. In 2023, the Russian authorities, aiming to optimize budget expenditures, decided to reduce payments under the damper program. The damper is a subsidy paid to fuel distributors for selling fuel domestically at relatively low prices.
Since the beginning of summer, wholesale prices for A95 gasoline on the Russian exchange have risen by 35%, and since the start of the year, by more than 50%. A92 has increased by 40%. Even at these high gasoline prices, there still isn't enough for everyone. People complain that fuel can only be bought with vouchers intended for businesses and special equipment.
In Russia, the goal is to cut expenses as much as possible. The main reason for these expenses is waging a full-scale war against Ukraine. But Russia does not want to stop the war. That's why it seems to me that a decision was made to cut back on damper payments. Moreover, a meeting to optimize damper payments is scheduled for early September in Russia. But most likely they decided to cut these payments even before that meeting. And as shown in September 2023, when damper payments are cut, the businesses involved in fuel sales simply hold back the fuel and don't allow it to be sold, since doing so would either mean a loss for them or the profit margin would not be as high as it could be.
Journalists report that the self-proclaimed head of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, admitted on a local TV channel that there are fuel problems on the peninsula and predicted that there will be a gasoline shortage for another month. The sale of AI-92 gasoline has also been suspended for residents of the Kuril district, which is part of the Sakhalin region, because the entire supply there is needed for special vehicles. The gasoline situation could be resolved by Putin's friend, the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko. However, he is in no hurry to do so.
In 2019, Russia decided to implement a tax maneuver. What did it entail? It meant that instead of an export tax on oil, a tax on oil extraction was introduced. Why is this important in the context of Belarus? Because Russia and Belarus are a union state, and by agreement, the oil export tax that Russia collected in the case of other countries, or rather in the case of Belarus in this context, went into the budget of the Republic of Belarus. In other words, Belarus didn't pay anything, and the mineral extraction tax did not go into the revenue of the Republic of Belarus. This was done for one simple reason, because Russia understood that Belarus was making money by taking raw materials from it and turning that raw material, oil, into petroleum products. And for 5 years, starting in 2019 and finishing in 2024, they spent time trying to minimize as much as possible the amount of fuel produced in Belarus.
Essentially, Russia ended up facing exactly what it was fighting against. With his stubbornness, Putin continues to drive the country into a pit of shortages and high prices, and ordinary people end up being the victims of his actions.
Trump continues to shock with his scandalous statements.
I have the right to do whatever I want. I am the President of the United States.
And that's exactly why the US president started talking about sanctions for Ukraine. Well, that's like punishing a child for being beaten up by older kids. No, he did mention Russia too, saying that everyone who doesn't want peace will face America's wrath.
Thousands of mostly young people are dying every week. If I can prevent this by imposing sanctions or using very high tariffs that will cost Russia or Ukraine or anyone dearly, I have stopped 7 wars.
But there is still a light at the end of this tunnel. Trump called Russia's statement about President Zelensky's illegitimacy nonsense.
It doesn't matter what they say. Everyone is just putting on a show. It's all nonsense.
Although not really, because along with that he hinted that Zelensky is just as much to blame for the war as Putin.
Zelensky isn't completely innocent either. It truly takes 2 individuals to tango.
Yeah, and according to Trump's words, his guilt lies in the fact that Ukraine decided to fight back against Russia.
I'm sure Ukraine thought they were going to win. Are you going to defeat someone who is 15 times bigger than you? Biden shouldn't have allowed this to happen.
In short, Trump keeps taking us on an emotional roller coaster. But it wasn't just Trump making statements. His special envoy, Steve Witkoff, did too. What do you think he said? Putin wants peace. Seriously?
Vladimir Putin wants to bring an end to the ongoing war. A comprehensive peace proposal is currently on the table.
In situations like this, I have only one question. Are you fooling yourself or us? And what do you think about all of this? Write your thoughts in the comments. It will be very interesting to read them.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
US President Donald Trump convinced Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban to soften his stance on Ukraine's European integration. This was reported by Politico. Journalists write that Orban agreed to lift the blockade on Ukraine's European integration after a personal conversation with the American president. However, it is not specified how Trump managed to persuade the Hungarian Prime Minister. US President Donald Trump has now convinced Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who opposes Ukraine's membership in the EU but has indicated support for Moldova's accession, to change his position on Kyiv's entry into the EU. It is also known that earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky asked Trump to influence Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban so that he would not block Ukraine's accession to the European Union. But personally, I can't even begin to guess what leverage Trump used that made Orban actually give up actively opposing Ukraine's entry into the EU. Do you have any guesses about this? Trump's tariffs on India have already come into effect. According to Bloomberg, the US has actually doubled tariffs on a number of Indian goods from 25% to 50%. And as is known, this decision is due to India's continued purchases of Russian oil. The only exceptions were certain industrial sectors, in particular electronics exports, which will temporarily protect Apple's large-scale investments in Indian factories, as well as pharmaceutical products. The tariffs will hit the textile and jewelry industries the hardest. Meanwhile, the publication Vyaz reports that Trump has tried to speak by phone with Indian Prime Minister Modi 4 times in recent weeks, but Modi is offended. In New Delhi, they consider Washington's actions to be unfair and unjustified. This week, an American delegation was supposed to visit India to negotiate a trade agreement before the additional tariffs come into effect. However, now such a visit is no longer planned. Let me remind you that at the beginning of August, Trump imposed an additional 25% tariff on India for purchasing Russian oil and also called the Indian economy dead. In addition to this, starting from August 27, 2023, significant additional tariffs came into full effect so that the total tariffs imposed on all Indian exports to the United States of America will now amount to a substantial 50%. Ramzan Kadyrov is preparing his family for his demise. To protect his loved ones from attacks by enemies, the head of Chechnya is strengthening their positions by appointing them to leadership roles. Observers have already counted about 80 such family appointments. Details in our report.
The system of power in Chechnya has long been built around the cult of the Kadyrov family. For Ramzan Kadyrov, this is both a strength and a weakness. Everything is personally subordinated to him. But new data show that this is not just about controlling the region. Don is building a true dynasty, consolidating his influence in case of his death.
I appoint only those individuals whom I completely trust.
According to BBC estimates, more than 80 members of the Kadyrov clan now hold key positions in the government. 20 control the security forces, 11 sit in parliament, and the rest are ministers, businessmen, heads of foundations and sports clubs. This is not a coincidence. It is a carefully constructed system of hereditary power transfer.
People have simply resigned themselves to this fate. They are not completely subdued, I know this. We have a very serious underground movement in Chechnya. But today the situation in Chechnya can be viewed as, well, a concentration camp where the entire population is held hostage. There are those who serve this regime, and we, both on television and in propaganda, see only those who serve this system, these occupation structures, and the general population who are waiting and biding their time. No one sees or notices them. People are simply trying to survive and make it through this situation.
Kadyrov has also strengthened the system through marriage alliances. His children have married into at least 15 influential Chechen clans, the Delimkanovs, the Geremayevs, the Vismuradovs, and others. In this way, through marriages and business, he creates a shield for his family, turning Chechnya into his personal principality.
Through these significant marriage ties and strategic alliances, Kadyrov is actively trying to secure the personal and unwavering support of the most influential and powerful Chechen clans. just in case this informal and precarious contract with Putin, the Russian dictator and supreme leader, is unexpectedly terminated. We know that for many years, Kadyrov had the right to basically do whatever he wanted and remain unpunished. And he actively took advantage of this, whether it was political assassinations, influencing federal politics, corruption, or these harems that the project reported on. So if Vladimir Putin does indeed abandon this established logic of personal immunity for Ramzan Kadyrov and his immediate circle, then the Kadyrov family will inevitably have to rely solely on the loyalty of other influential Chechen clans, those who are certainly close to Kadyrov's own, but still exist quite separately and distinctly from it.
The heirs have already been assigned their roles. The eldest, Akhmat, heads the sports and football club Akhmat. The second, Zelimkhan, runs the fight club and the boxing federation. According to experts, the main successor is the third son, Adam. His scandalous notoriety has only helped him. After beating a prisoner in the Grozny detention center, the teenager was not charged. Instead, he was rewarded. A few weeks later, he became the youngest head of the regional leader's security service. At 17, Adam was already the secretary of the Chechen Security Council. His career path remarkably mirrors Ramzan's own journey.
Everything is also carefully planned out for the women in the family. The eldest daughter, Aishat, went from fashion designer to deputy prime minister and now owns the Chechen mineral water business with billions in revenue. Khadijat, Tabarik and Kutmat, along with their husbands, have also been placed in key positions in government and business. But behind the facade of glamour and ostentatious luxury lies fear. The Dondon's own health has been a concern for several years now. Frequent medical leaves, rumors of a serious diagnosis, and absences from federal events. For the Kremlin, Kadyrov remains a guarantor of stability, but the question of a successor is still unresolved. The law does not allow his sons to take the position of head before the age of 30. This means that Moscow will have to seek a compromise between the interests of the clan and the formal requirements of the law. And while the family prepares to inherit power after Ramzan's departure, behind the scenes Moscow may be preparing a completely different scenario.
Poland will block Ukraine's accession to the EU until the dispute over the Volhynia tragedy is resolved. This statement was made by Poland's Minister of Defense, Senia Kamysz.
I said that Ukraine will not resolve the issue of the Volhynia massacre, the genocide in Volhynia, unless exhumations are carried out and the memory of the victims is commemorated. It has no chance of joining the EU.
And continuing on this topic, over the past 3 years, Ukrainians have contributed $28 billion to Poland's budget. These are the figures provided by Skilki Info. And officially, according to the publication, Ukrainians in Poland paid $12.8 billion in taxes, while government spending on aid to refugees amounted to up to $4 billion. By the way, speaking of payments, the Polish government has agreed with the proposal of Polish President Karol Nawrocki to limit financial assistance to Ukrainians. According to this proposal, only employed Ukrainian refugees in Poland will receive payments. Life in Russia has become so good that now Russians can't even cover the cost of getting a child ready for school on their own. Residents of Putin's superpower are forced to take out loans for uniforms, pencil cases, and notebooks. And the number of such loans before the current school year is breaking all records. This year, Russians have taken out a record number of microloans. Every 20th microcredit in Russia was taken out to prepare their child for the new school year. Yes, during the war years, the standard of living in Russia has grown so much that parents can't provide their children with even the most basic necessities for September 1st.
Before the start of the school year, the share of microloans for educational purposes rose to record levels. In July-August of 2025, it reached 4.6% of the total number of microloans issued. A year earlier, the share for the same period was 3.3%, and in July-August of 2023, it was only 2.6%.
According to the Russian publication Gazeta.ru, the increase in microloans during the summer is due to the fact that Russians want to save money and buy everything necessary for school in advance and at a lower price.
The record share of loans for education in July-August 2025 is due to increased expenses for preparing children for school. In turn, the shift in demand to an earlier period is due to people's desire to save money. It is well known that school supplies become more expensive by the end of August, so it is better to buy them in advance.
But how can you save money if, according to data from the central bank, the full cost of an unsecured microloan of up to 30,000 rubles for a 1-month term amounts to 288% per annum? The increase in demand for microloans points to one thing: Russians simply don't have enough money.
Legally, in Russia, the annual interest rate is 292%. So in other words, the poorest person will pay 10 times more than someone who has the ability to get a bank loan. The authorities do not restrict microfinance organizations. Right now, that's almost 10 trillion rubles in borrowed money. And that's 10 million citizens who every month pay hundreds of percent in interest to lenders.
And in general, the Kremlin isn't particularly eager to allocate money for Russians' education. This year, 140 times less was allocated for educational loans in Russia than for building pre-trial detention centers.
In 2025, the Russian government will allocate 2.5 billion rubles for educational loans. The order was signed by Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. According to him, the funds are intended for 214,000 students who will be able to take out a loan at 3% annual interest. The loan is provided for obtaining secondary vocational and higher education to individuals from the age of 14. At the same time, the amount allocated by the government to support this preferential program is quite insignificant. For comparison, the funding for the federal program for the development of the penal system, under which it is planned to build 11 new pre-trial detention centers, was recently increased from 105 billion to 359.2 billion rubles.
There simply isn't enough money in the Russian budget for education and everything related to it. So you have to take out a microloan at insane interest rates which are practically impossible to pay back. But the Kremlin simply doesn't regulate this process. So microcredit companies in Russia are popping up like mushrooms after the rain, making poor Russians even poorer.
The authorities don't require from them what they require from banks, and that's why they keep growing. That's also why even large banks are moving into this kind of loan sharking. They set up subsidiary microfinance organizations and give loans to the poorest, making them even poorer. In many countries, such activity is illegal.
70% of all loans in Russia are microloans. After the start of the special military operation, they began to get poorer even faster. Poverty and lack of education drive Russian citizens to join the so-called special military operation, and that's exactly what the Kremlin wants.
On the night of August 27th, Ukrainian drones attacked Rostov in Russia. As always, Russian air defense shot everything down. But there's a catch. They did it in such a way that the drone crashed into a residential building. But what's interesting is not so much the drone attack itself, but rather who it could have affected. Russian telegram channels report that the drones targeted the house of Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine who fled to Russia. Russians also note that the attack was deliberate.
Please just stop right now.
A Nazi drone from the Ukrainian armed forces struck the home of Ukraine's last legitimate president, Viktor Yanukovych. It is likely that the Zelensky regime decided to eliminate Yanukovych, who was supposed to take power in the country after Ukraine's liberation and demilitarization. This was revenge for the fact that Yanukovych did not give in to those who were jumping on the Maidan and chanting Moskalyaku Nagilyaku Sil Muombomaidi Wolmondistutu. Moreover, they say that as a result of the attack, our former leader was eliminated. Of course, that sounds good. Frankly, that's exactly what a traitor deserves. But it should be noted that this is being written by Russian telegram channels, which very rarely tell the truth. Please like this video to support what we do. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Ukraine Today so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. See you soon.